Have you ever wondered if the wind could carry the voices of those we lost? One summer, a worn letter led a struggling veteran named Jake Miller and his loyal dog Buddy back to the old wooden workshop his late mother once loved by the river. There, he discovered not just her hidden research, but the healing song of Riverbend itself. Through storms and sunlight, through loss and faith, he learned that miracles are not seen. They are felt in the wind that never stops singing. Now sit back and enjoy the story of Riverbend Sanctuary, where love and grace find their way back home. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The afternoon air hung warm and bright above the small town of Riverbend. Sunlight lay across the river, and the wooden roofs like a quiet golden sheet, and the breeze smelled of pine sap and sawdust. Jake Miller worked along the side wall of the repair workshop where he earned his living. He had the build of a man who trusted his hands more than his words. Broad shoulders, steady arms, a neck browned by sun, and the small, pale marks that linger after hard years. His hair was dark brown and cut short for practicality. Stubble framed his jaw by late afternoon, not from style, but from forgetting the mirror when the day grew long. He had left the service 2 years before and carried the habits of a soldier he no longer wished to be. He stood straight without thinking. He counted steps without meaning to. Sudden noises made his breath catch, and then steady again through will alone. Work had become his shelter. A plank to sand, a hinge to set, a chair leg to mend. The rhythm held him in place like a quiet metronome. The town itself lived in a slow summer hush. Riverbend was small, in the way a place becomes small when its stories are known by heart. The river moved heavy and brown under the brightness of July sun, and dragonflies flickered above the reeds. The old mill on the far bend did not turn anymore. 2 workshops survived near the main road. Jake was a hired pair of hands in one of them. The job was enough to pay rent for a modest room behind the workshop and to buy feed and good food for the dog who shadowed him. The dog was named Buddy. He was a German shepherd of 6 summers, large and alert, with a black saddle across a tan coat that gleamed like warm brass in the sun. His eyes were dark amber and steady, the eyes of a companion who watched more than he barked. His ears pricked and turned with every shift of air, as if the wind spoke in a language he remembered from a life before Riverbend. Buddy had worked beside Jake during their last tour. He knew the difference between a sudden bang and a meaningful sound. He knew the way a voice changes when fear passes through it. Here in town, he had learned gentler tasks. He waited under the workbench, carried small bundles of rags in his mouth, and pushed open the screen door with his shoulder when Jake returned with his hands full. When the heat swelled and the work slowed, he lay on the cool porch boards with his long legs outstretched and watched the road like a careful sentry at ease. On this day of high summer, the light pressed down in a bright hush. Cicadas hummed in the cottonwoods beyond the yard. Somewhere upriver, a motorboat murmured, and then faded. Jake set a repaired latch on the bench and wiped his palms on a rag. Sweat ran along the line of his spine and darkened his gray shirt at the shoulders. He drank from a tin cup, set it aside, and looked past the yard toward the road as if something might arrive. He did not know why he looked, only that he did. A small parcel rested against the inside of the screen door when he went in to fetch more screws. He paused. He did not expect deliveries. He had no family in town and made no orders except for wood and nails, and those came bundled and plain. The parcel was wrapped in simple brown paper, tied with cotton string. The corners were softened as if it had traveled for a while. The address was written by hand in neat strokes. He could read his name and the name of the shop and the town. His chest tightened before he even touched it because he knew the handwriting. It was firm and careful and shaped by a patient woman who had taught him his letters at a scarred kitchen table. He lifted the parcel in both hands and carried it to the workbench. Buddy followed and sat close, the tip of his tail dusting the floor. Jake ran a thumb along the ink. He saw the way the J curved and the way the M never quite closed. The air seemed to thicken with old summers, the smell of sliced apples, the sound of his mother turning pages while a pie browned in the oven. He swallowed and steadied his breath. He took out his small knife and cut the string. The paper opened with the soft sound of memory being unwrapped. Inside was a plain box. Inside the box lay a folded letter and a map drawn on thick paper. He unrolled the map first, because the shape of it was less dangerous than the shape of a sentence in his mother's hand. The lines were familiar. The river like a sleeping snake. The road that bent around the workshops. The grid of the 2 streets near the diner. A small red mark sat near a patch of drawn trees not far from the Riverbend. Beside it was written in the same hand, Old Mill Workshop. The map showed a path through the narrow stand of pines to a door he had not opened in years. He knew the mill by sight, though he had never worked there. The old place had been empty since his childhood. A quiet hulk of gray boards and silent rafters where swallows nested under the eaves. He set the map down and picked up the letter. He did not open it at once. His thumb ran once more along the crease, and then he spread the paper flat. The first line gave him back the way she used to say his name when the day began and the kettle sang. The words were simple. She told him that if he was reading, then she had already gone. She told him not to soften grief with guilt. She told him to walk to the old mill and to stand there in the heat of the day and to listen with the patience of the boy he once was. She told him that the summer wind can heal if a heart allows it. She had written that line years ago, when breath still came easy, and she still believed he would come home in time for one more July. He read the letter twice and then a third time. He did not speak. Buddy lifted one paw and set it on the bench rail, a gesture he used when he sensed a tremor in his human. Jake set his hand on the dog's paw and left it there until the tremor passed. The sounds of the day returned by gentle degrees. A fly touched the window and moved on. A board cooled and gave a small sigh. Outside, heat rolled along the porch boards like a slow tide. He folded the letter along its crease and slid it back into the box. He picked up the map again and studied the marks closely. The route from the shop to the old mill would take 20 minutes by foot if the path through the pines still held. The red mark sat near the rear door, where supplies once came in by wagon. He tried to recall the last time he had walked that way, and could not. The years had stacked in his mind like lumber, and he had not lifted them to look beneath. His thoughts moved across the map and then beyond it. He remembered a boy who had wanted a steady life of work and small triumphs and fish pulled from a river at dusk. He remembered a young man who had left that life to serve. He remembered the day he came home and found that the place he loved had changed without him, not by malice, but by time. He had tried to build a new life by muscle and schedule alone. The letter in the plain box shifted something he could not name. It did not promise miracles. It did not name the hurt. It only asked him to stand in a place his parents had once cared for and listen to the wind like a student of summer. Buddy's ears tipped toward the open window. A faint breeze moved in with the scent of sun-warmed resin and river water. Jake felt the stir of air against his forearm where sawdust clung. He listened without searching for meaning. He let the sound of the afternoon move through him, as if he were not a wall, but a field. The warmth pressed against his back. The light pooled at his boots. The wind carried heat rather than cool, yet within that heat there was a softness he had not known in a long while. He did not feel joy. He felt room. He placed the map gently in the box and closed the lid. He cleaned the bench with the care he gave every end of day. Tools to their hooks. Screws counted and poured back into their jars. The broom along the floorboards until the dust gathered in a low hill and then into the pan. He did these things because work was a prayer when words felt unreliable. When the tasks were done, he stepped out onto the porch and leaned against the post. The yard swam in late light. The river shone beyond. Buddy pressed his shoulder against Jake's leg and stood there like a pillar with a heartbeat. Jake rested his hand on the broad head and felt the slow assurance of breath moving in and out. He thought of the map. He thought of the red mark at the rear door. He thought of a woman who had believed that wind can carry more than heat, that it can carry forgiveness and memory in the first light step toward healing. The thoughts did not crowd. They simply stood with him in the golden air. He waited until the sun laid a final bright path across the yard, and then he turned back inside. He set the box where the morning light would find it. He filled Buddy's bowl and watched the dog eat with neat patience. He washed his cup and set it to dry. When he lay down later in the narrow room behind the workshop, the night air eased through the screen and stroked the sweat from his brow. He closed his eyes on the image of a path through pines and a door at the back of an old mill. He did not make plans. He did not name a time. He let the day end with the letter in the room and the wind moving softly from the river. The morning air shimmered with heat rising from the ground. Sunlight spilled through the canopy of oak and pine, scattering gold over the winding dirt road that led toward the old workshop near the river. The hum of cicadas never paused, and the scent of warm resin floated thick in the air. Jake Miller drove slowly along the narrow path, the old truck rattling with every stone. The steering wheel felt hot beneath his hands. Sweat gathered along his collar and soaked into his gray shirt. Buddy sat upright in the passenger seat, head turned toward the open window, nose twitching at the scents of the forest. His fur caught the light in shifting tones of bronze and black. Every so often, his ears flicked back toward Jake, as if to check whether his companion was still steady. Jake kept his eyes on the road, though his thoughts wandered to the folded map lying on the seat between them. He had not slept much the previous night. The letter had lingered in his mind like a whisper. His mother's words had been gentle, but carried weight. She had asked him to listen to the wind, and even now, as branches bowed above him, he tried to understand what she had meant. He told himself this trip was nothing more than curiosity, yet a faint ache stirred in his chest that felt older than logic. The map had drawn him not only toward a place, but toward something he feared to face: the memory of her voice, the years lost to war, the silence between them that had stretched too long. The dirt road narrowed and curved along the river's edge. Jake slowed the truck and parked beside a fallen tree. The air buzzed with summer heat. Insects darted through sunbeams, and the smell of pine needles mixed with damp earth. He stepped out, stretching his back, feeling the stiffness from long workdays and restless nights. Buddy leapt down, lightly shook once, and looked up at him with bright eyes, waiting for command. Jake pointed ahead. "Come on, partner." The dog trotted forward, tail level, every movement alert but calm. The forest grew denser as they walked. Ferns brushed against Jake's boots, and shafts of sunlight cut through the green gloom like slanted paths of fire. The sound of the river grew softer, but steadier, a deep rhythmic pulse beneath the chatter of birds. He recognized this landscape, though he had not seen it in decades. When he was small, his parents had brought him here for picnics. His mother had collected the odd-shaped pieces of driftwood that she used for her carving. He remembered her laughter, the way she held the wind in her hair like a banner. She had called this place her song garden. The workshop appeared at last beyond a stand of birch trees. The building slouched slightly to one side, the roof line bowed from years of neglect. Its walls were gray, where the paint had peeled, but in the light they still held a faint honey hue. Windows gaped open without glass. Weeds grew high around the porch steps. Jake stood still for a long time, watching the dust drift in the heat, and felt a weight settle over him, not of fear, but of something close to reverence. This had been her place once before illness, before the long, quiet years when he was gone. Buddy sniffed the airtail flicking once. He padded up the porch steps and disappeared inside. Jake followed. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. The smell of old wood and resin rose at once, mixed with the faint metallic tang of rust. Dust motes spun through the golden air. He let his eyes adjust slowly. Wooden tables stood in a row, scarred by blades and time. Shelves lined the far wall, holding glass jars with faded labels, each filled with nails, screws, bits of sanded pine. The sunlight caught the edges of tools, still hanging neatly on the pegs. It was as if she had left and never returned, expecting to continue her work another day. He ran a hand along the work table. A layer of dust coated his fingers, soft and fine. Beneath it, he could see faint carvings in the wood, small wave patterns and circles intersecting each other, a language of sound made visible. He remembered her sketching similar shapes at home, explaining that everything in nature had its own vibration, its own tone. She had believed that wind, when passing through certain shapes of wood or metal, could heal the heart. He had teased her once for chasing something invisible. Now he wondered whether she had been closer to truth than he knew. A faint jingle broke the silence. Jake looked up. Buddy stood near the far corner of the room, tail still, ears pricked forward. Another jingle came, soft and uncertain. Jake crossed the floor. There, hanging from a beam near the broken window, was a set of wind chimes. They were old, the strings frayed, the metal tubes mottled with rust. One tube had fallen loose and hung by a thread. When the light breeze moved through the chime, gave a weak, uneven note that trembled and then faded. Buddy tilted his head as if listening. Jake reached up and steadied the frame. It was the same style his mother used to craft thin copper pipes bent with precision. He turned one pipe in his hand and saw the initials carved faintly near the rim. A small M, her mark. Something bright caught his eye. Stuck between two boards near the window was a narrow ribbon, faded to pale blue, but once clearly vibrant. He pulled it free carefully. It had been pressed there long enough to leave its color on the wood. He knew this ribbon. His mother had tied her hair with it when she worked outdoors. He had a memory of her bending over a carving table, the ribbon fluttering each time she exhaled. The weight in his chest deepened. He could almost hear her hum again, low and tuneless, keeping time with the movement of her hands. He sat on the step outside and let the air move through him. The sun beat down on his shoulders. Sweat stung his eyes. Buddy lay in the shade beside him, panting lightly, his tongue lolling. Jake reached down and rubbed the fur along the dog's neck. "She was here," he said quietly. The words came out rough. Buddy lifted his head and gave a small sound, not a bark, not a whine, but something that sounded like recognition. Jake looked toward the river beyond the trees. The air shimmered above the water, thick with heat, yet the wind moved there too, tracing small ripples on the surface. He felt as though the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to listen. He rose and walked the perimeter of the workshop. The back door hung from one hinge. Inside the storage room held wooden frames, jars of resin hardened to amber, and a workbench scattered with tools. On the wall, a sketch had survived beneath a sheet of dusty glass. It showed a cross-section of a wooden tube with notes scrawled in the margins. Wind frequency, vibration curve, healing resonance. He traced the words with a finger and felt the tremor of memory move through him. She had not been chasing air. She had been trying to give sound a home. Outside again, the sun had shifted lower. The forest buzzed with late-day heat. Jake sat on the porch steps, the blue ribbon wound between his fingers. The rough fabric caught against the calluses of his palm. He felt the same quiet ache that had followed him since her passing, the guilt for not being there, the anger at his own absence. Yet here, surrounded by the evidence of her patience and craft, the anger loosened. The wind stirred the chime again, and though the note was faint, it did not sound broken. It sounded like the beginning of something. He closed his eyes. The hum of the insects blurred with the steady breath of the river. The chime rang once more clear and thin, then stopped. Buddy's paw brushed against his knee. Jake opened his eyes and looked at the dog, who gazed back with that unflinching loyalty that asked for nothing but trust. He nodded slightly. "We will fix it," he said. Buddy's ears twitched. "We will make it sing again." He rose and stepped back into the heat of the room. He gathered the chime, carefully avoiding the brittle threads, and placed it on the work table. Tomorrow, he would bring new cord and oil for the copper. He would clean this place one corner at a time and see what his mother had left for him to find. The day was ending, but the air still glowed with warmth. He opened both windows to let the wind pass through. The room filled with light. Dust swirled like smoke. For the first time, the silence of the workshop did not feel empty. It felt waiting. When he left, the sun hung low behind the trees. The old mill stood bathed in gold. The river caught the light and flung it back in shards. Jake paused beside the truck. Buddy jumped in and turned once before settling. Jake looked back at the workshop. The chime stirred faintly in the window, a single flicker of sound chasing the evening. He breathed in the scent of pine and hot metal and resin, and in that simple air, he felt her presence again, not as a ghost, but as a note of music still trembling on the edge of hearing. The morning rose clear and still above Riverbend. The air carried the scent of warm pine and the faint sweetness of river grass. Sunlight drifted through the trees in long gold ribbons, and the world seemed to wait for the first stirring of wind. Jake Miller parked his truck near the edge of the old workshop and stepped out with a sense of quiet purpose. His shirt clung to his back, the heat already pressing against the day, though the sun had barely lifted. Buddy trotted beside him, tail brushing lightly against the air, his nose low as he traced the invisible stories left on the ground. The dog looked rested and alert, the strength in his body clear in the way his muscles shifted beneath his coat. Jake watched him for a moment, then looked toward the workshop door. The place no longer felt as foreign as it had yesterday. He had spent the night thinking about what to do next, his mind returning again and again to the memory of his mother's letter and the fragile music that had hung in the air before it broke apart. Inside, the light spilled across the dusty floorboards, catching on the thin threads of spider silk stretched between the tools. The copper chime lay on the workbench where he had left it. Its pipes were dull, the color of old pennies, the cords brittle with age. Jake rolled up his sleeves and began his work. He filled a small bowl with clean water from the river and dipped a rag into it, then started wiping each pipe carefully. The motion was slow and deliberate. With every pass, the rust gave way to faint glints of color beneath, not bright, yet but alive. The sound of the cloth against metal was soft and steady like breathing. It soothed him in ways he could not name. He remembered his mother's hands moving in the same rhythm when she worked. She had never hurried, never fought the material. She used to say that patience was the only language nature understood. He had not understood her then. As a soldier, he had lived by orders and urgency, by the idea that quickness was survival. But here alone, with the dust and the smell of oil, he began to see what she meant. The world was not made for rushing. Healing came in stillness. Buddy sat nearby, his gaze fixed on Jake's movements. When Jake paused to stretch his shoulders, Buddy leaned forward and sniffed at one of the polished pipes, then sneezed softly. Jake smiled faintly. The sound broke the silence, like a small mercy. He spoke without thinking. "Not much of a tune yet, huh?" His voice echoed lightly in the open room. Buddy wagged his tail once, as if to say that sound. Any sound was good enough for now. By midday, the chime shone in the sunlight, its copper warm and clean. Jake replaced the frayed cords with new twine he had brought from town. His hands worked with a quiet confidence he had not felt in years. When the last knot was tied, he lifted the chime by its wooden frame and tested the balance. The tube swayed gently, catching the light like liquid bronze. He carried it to the porch and stood beneath the beam where the old one had hung. The nail was still there, bent but sturdy. He pressed it straight and hung the chime. For a long moment, nothing moved. The air lay heavy and unmoving, filled only with a low hum of insects. Jake stepped back and wiped his hands on his jeans. His heart beat faster than it should have for such a small task. He felt a strange nervousness, as if he were waiting for someone to answer. Buddy came to stand beside him, tail-still eyes fixed on the river beyond the trees. Then, as if on cue, the wind began to stir. It started as a faint breath moving through the pines, a whisper so soft it barely touched the leaves. Jake felt it slide across his face like cool silk. The copper pipes trembled, then rang out with a single clear tone. Another followed higher, then a third, until the sound gathered into a fragile harmony. The music lifted into the summer air, carried outward across the river. It was not loud, but bright, each note seeming to find its place among the murmurs of water and the soft rustle of branches. Jake closed his eyes. For the first time since his mother's passing, the silence inside him broke. He could almost hear her humming again, that quiet tune she had used to keep time while she carved. The notes of the chime seemed to echo it perfectly. He felt the pressure behind his eyes and let the breath leave him slowly, steady, and quiet. The air smelled of metal, warmed by sun, and pine warmed by wind. He whispered, without meaning to, "You did it, Mom. You made it sing." Buddy gave a low bark, soft and quick. Jake opened his eyes and looked down. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his body tense but not fearful. His gaze was locked on the chime, watching it sway. Another gust came fuller this time, bending the grass and stirring the trees. The chime answered with a melody that felt alive. Buddy tilted his head, gave another short bark, and then sat as though listening to someone beyond the visible world. Jake knelt beside him and placed a hand on his fur. The dog's heartbeat was steady under his palm. He looked into those amber eyes and felt something pass between them, an understanding too deep for words. Maybe the dog heard what he heard. Maybe the wind carried voices that only some could recognize. He stayed there until the sun slid lower in the sky, each gust of wind bringing a new thread of sound. The copper gleamed as if it held its own fire. Jake thought of all the times he had tried to bury memory under work and silence. He had believed that forgetting was the same as healing. But here in this place, his mother had loved. He saw that remembering could be gentler. The wind did not erase pain. It carried it, turned it, shaped it into something that sang. When the breeze softened again, he stood and walked toward the edge of the porch. The river reflected the light like molten glass. Buddy came to his side, leaning slightly against his leg. Jake could feel the warmth of the dog's body through the denim. He let his hand rest on Buddy's head. The world felt less heavy than it had that morning. He was still a man marked by loss, but he no longer felt alone inside it. He turned back to the chime. It hung quiet now, the pipes swaying gently in the fading light. He would come tomorrow to fix the window, to clear the overgrown path, to bring life back to the place piece by piece. For now, the music lingered in his mind, blending with the hum of the river. The workshop no longer felt like a relic. It felt like a beginning. As Jake and Buddy started back toward the truck, a final breeze came down from the ridge. It swept through the open door of the workshop, across the chime, and sent one last note ringing into the dusk. Buddy's ears lifted, and Jake turned his head, slightly smiling in the half-light. The sound drifted away, slowly fading into the rhythm of the river, until it was gone, leaving behind only the warmth of the air and the sense that somewhere in the spaces between, someone was still listening. The heat of the afternoon pressed heavily over Riverbend. The air shimmered above the road, and the scent of pine mixed with the sharp tang of drying earth. The sun stood high, pale and unforgiving, while in the distance clouds began to gather at the edge of the sky, faint as smoke, but thickening by the minute. Jake Miller wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned his shoulder against the porch post of the old workshop. His shirt clung to him, streaked with sawdust and the smell of oil. The rhythmic rasp of sandpaper had filled most of his morning, and now even the tools seemed to hum with heat. Buddy lay stretched in the shade beneath the steps, tongue-hanging ears flicking at every buzz of a fly. The dog's coat shimmered like bronze under the dim light. The two of them had fallen into a silence that belonged to long summer days, steady, heavy, unbroken, except by the wind. Jake's gaze drifted toward the river. It shimmered in the sunlight, slow and wide, reflecting the growing darkness that crept in from the horizon. He had begun to notice that stillness like this often meant change. It was the kind of quiet his mother once called waiting air, the kind that holds its breath before the world turns. The crunch of tires on gravel broke through the hum of cicadas. Buddy lifted his head, ears pricking forward, tail sweeping the ground once before he stood. Jake turned toward the sound. A government-issued truck rolled up the dirt path, the kind used by rangers and field surveyors. Dust trailed behind it in lazy spirals. When the engine cut off, a woman stepped out tall and steady, moving with the calm of someone used to wilderness paths and long days in the sun. Her name was Nora Hayes, and Jake recognized her from the few times he had gone into town to renew his property papers. She worked for the county's environmental service, known for keeping the logging companies in check. Nora was in her late 30s, broad-shouldered, but lean with weathered tan skin, and dark hair cut to her chin, streaked faintly by the sun. Her eyes were gray-green, sharp but kind, and there was a patience in her movements that came from years of listening before speaking. She waved once and approached the porch boots crunching over the gravel. "Afternoon, Jake," she said, her voice steady and low. "You keeping this place alive again, I see." Jake nodded and offered a half smile. "Trying to. It was my mother's. Thought I would fix it up a bit." Nora's eyes drifted toward the hanging chime. It swayed gently, though there was no wind. "I remember her," she said softly. "She came to town once to present her work about sound frequencies in wood. People did not quite understand it, but she had that look in her eyes, like she could hear what the rest of us missed." Jake looked down at his hands, rough with cuts from the day's work. Yeah, that was her. For a moment, the only sound was the slow buzzing of cicadas. Then Nora's tone shifted. "Listen, Jake, I did not just stop by to admire the handiwork. There is something you should know. The county just got a proposal from Skyline Energy. They are planning to develop this whole Riverbend into a luxury resort. Roads, cabins, docks, the works." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "You mean they are going to tear down the woods?" "That is the plan," she said. "They have already bought up the northern section near Mill Creek. This land is next if they get approval. They will file the permits next week." Jake looked past her toward the tree line where the shadows were beginning to darken. "My mother used to study this forest," he said quietly. "She said it was one of the last places where wind carried its own echo." He ran a thumb across the porch rail. "And now they want to bury it under cement." Nora crossed her arms, her gaze firm but sympathetic. "I know how it feels. I have seen Skyline work before. They are good at convincing people that progress is prettier than peace. I can file a report, try to delay the permits, but I cannot stop them alone. If you want this place safe, you will need evidence of its ecological value, something solid. Recordings, data, anything that proves what your mother found here." Jake met her eyes. "I do not have much left. Just her notes and what is still standing." "Then start there," she said. "You have a week before the hearing." She glanced toward the chime again. If she was right about this place, maybe the proof's already in the air. The words lingered between them like a quiet challenge. Jake wanted to answer, but found none that fit. He had seen too much of the world's noise to believe that truth alone could stop a corporation. Yet something in Nora's tone carried conviction, and he felt the faint stir of purpose. A rumble of thunder rolled across the distance, low and uncertain. Both of them turned toward the river. The clouds that had been faint in the morning now thickened into heavy gray masses that swallowed the sun. The light dimmed to an amber haze. Nora squinted at the horizon. "Looks like summer's bringing its first storm," she said. "You might want to close up the place before it breaks." Jake nodded. "I have seen storms like that before. They come fast." Nora smiled faintly. "Then you will know what to do." She reached into her pocket and handed him a card. "Call me if you find anything. I will do what I can from my end." He took it, folding the card into his palm. "Thanks, Nora. I appreciate it." She gave a short nod and turned back toward her truck. The engine roared to life, and the tires kicked dust into the heavy air. Jake stood on the porch until the sound faded down the hill. Buddy whined softly and pressed close to his leg. The air had changed thicker now, damp-charged, with a scent that spoke of rain and electricity. Jake looked up. The wind had begun to move in restless bursts, tossing the treetops like waves. The copper chime swayed and gave a few short, uneven notes. It was not the gentle song from yesterday. It sounded uneasy, as if warning him. Jake reached down and rubbed Buddy's neck. "I know, boy. I feel it too." The dog's ears flattened and his nose lifted toward the clouds. Another rumble echoed closer this time. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air cool enough to raise goosebumps on Jake's arms. He glanced at the workshop, then at the river, the surface already rippling with the first scattered drops. He stepped to the door and looked once more at the trees bending in the wind. "Looks like the season's turning," he said quietly. Buddy barked once, sharp and alert, as if agreeing. Then the wind came in, full sweeping across the clearing and carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth. The storm was coming fast, and somewhere above the noise of the trees, Jake thought he could still hear the faint metallic ring of the chime trying to hold its tune against the rising wind. The night came heavy and wild over Riverbend. The storm rolled in from the west, swallowing the last traces of twilight. The trees bent under the first wave of wind, and thunder cracked across the sky like the earth itself was tearing open. Rain came down in thick sheets, pounding the tin roof of the workshop, filling the air with the roar of water and wind. Jake Miller stood by the window, watching the trees sway violently in the flashes of lightning. His jaw tightened as each gust hit harder than the last. He had lived through noise before explosions, gunfire, chaos, but this kind of sound was different. Nature did not shout out of anger. It warned. He could feel the storm crawling into his bones. Buddy paced near the door, restless tail low, but wagging nervously. The dog's ears twitched with every crash of thunder. His coat was soaked already, though they had not stepped outside. Jake ran a hand down the dog's back. "Easy, boy, it is. Just weather," he murmured, but even he did not believe it. The storm had a strange rhythm, like something alive moving through the valley. The lights flickered, once, then died. Darkness filled the room, broken only by the sharp white flashes through the windows. Jake grabbed the lantern from the shelf and lit it. The dim glow cast long, uneven shadows against the walls. Rain hammered against the panes, seeping through the cracks in thin lines that glistened under the light. Buddy froze, suddenly nose lifted, body tense. His ears stood straight, and a deep growl rose in his throat. Jake frowned. "What is it?" he whispered. The dog turned toward the door, barking once sharp and urgent, then again louder. Without warning, Buddy lunged toward the exit, scratching at the wooden frame. Jake cursed under his breath and pulled the door open. A wall of rain slammed into him, cold and violent. Buddy darted into the night, his dark coat vanishing into the curtain of water. Buddy Jake shouted, his voice lost to the wind. He grabbed his rain jacket and flashlight, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the storm. The path outside had turned into a river of mud. The rain stung his face as he struggled down the slope, light bouncing wildly in the dark. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment the forest lit up in stark white. In that instant, Jake saw Buddy near the riverbank, barking furiously at something half buried under a fallen pine. Jake rushed forward, slipping on the wet ground. When he reached the spot, he saw a man pinned beneath the heavy trunk water pooling around him. The stranger's arm twitched weakly. His hard hat lay cracked beside him, and mud covered most of his uniform. Jake knelt, shining the light closer. The man was young, mid-20s at most, with sharp features, half hidden by blood and rain. His skin was pale beneath the grime, and his breathing came in shallow bursts. Jake brushed away debris and leaned close. "Can you hear me?" the man groaned. His lips moved, barely audible under the storm. Help truck slid off the road. Jake examined the trunk. It had caught the man's leg at an angle no bone should bend. He felt the rain soak through his clothes as he tested the weight of the wood. It would not move easily. He looked at Buddy, who stood beside him, barking into the wind as if demanding action. Jake nodded. "All right, boy, let's do this." He found a thick branch nearby, wedged it under the trunk, and used all his weight to push down. The wood groaned and shifted just enough for the man to pull free. Jake grabbed him under the shoulders and dragged him back toward the workshop, boots sinking into the mud. The rain blinded him, and thunder rolled so close it rattled the ground. By the time they reached the porch, Jake's arms trembled with exhaustion. He hauled the man inside and kicked the door shut. Buddy shook himself, spraying water across the floor, then stood guard near the window. Jake lowered the stranger onto the wooden table and tore a strip from his own shirt to tie above the bleeding leg. The man winced, eyes fluttering open again. "You are safe," Jake said, keeping his voice calm. "Just stay still." The man's eyes, gray and unfocused, darted around the room. "You live here." "Something like that." Jake pulled another towel from the shelf and wiped the mud from the man's face. The lightning outside illuminated the stranger for a brief second. He looked barely out of college, his jaw smooth, his features soft, the kind of man more familiar with keyboards than axes. Jake noticed the Skyline energy patch on his soaked jacket and felt a flicker of recognition and anger. "You work for them," he said flatly. The young man nodded weakly. "Field engineer. Name is Ryan. We were mapping soil density. The truck lost traction near the ridge." His voice broke as he shivered. "I thought I was done for." Jake exhaled slowly. "You almost were." He grabbed a blanket from the corner and threw it over him. Despite his frustration with Skyline, the soldier in him could not ignore a wounded man. Duty came before anger. As Jake tightened the bandage, something metallic glinted near Ryan's belt. The lantern light caught it just right, a small keychain shaped like a pine leaf, darkened by mud, but unmistakably crafted. Jake froze. He had seen that symbol before. It matched the iron keyhole under the floorboards of the old workshop. He reached out slowly and turned the charm in his fingers. "Where did you get this?" Ryan blinked, dazed. "They gave it to us. It is the company symbol, for access to certain survey sites." Why Jake said nothing. His pulse quickened. The charm's edges were engraved with faint markings, almost identical to those in his mother's old notebooks. It was not just a logo. It was a design she had once used for her research project, the one she called the Windline Sequence. He leaned back, staring at the key as thunder shook the walls. Buddy whined softly, pressing close to his leg, sensing his unease. Jake's mind raced. If Skyline used his mother's pattern, they had found something from her work, maybe even something buried beneath this very ground. Ryan's breathing steadied under the blanket, his exhaustion taking over. Jake looked down at him, torn between anger and suspicion. He could not decide whether the young man was an enemy or a message sent by fate. Outside, the storm raged louder. Rain poured through the cracks of the roof, dripping into a steady rhythm that mingled with the distant echo of the river. The copper chime above the window stirred faintly, letting out a long, trembling note. Jake turned toward it, the sound cutting through the chaos like a whisper. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing his mother's voice in memory follow the wind. He opened them again, staring at the key in his palm. The answers were here, he knew it now. Beneath the noise of rain and thunder, something in Riverbend was calling him to uncover what his mother had left behind. The morning after the storm came bright and silent. The air was heavy, with the smell of wet earth and pine sap. Mist rose from the river, curling between the trees like pale smoke. The forest looked washed clean, its colors deep and alive again, though branches littered the ground and puddles mirrored the sky. Jake Miller stepped out of the workshop, with Buddy close at his side. The yard was slick with mud, but sunlight shimmered on the puddles, warm and forgiving. His clothes were still damp from the night before, but he hardly noticed. His mind was caught on the image of that small pine leaf key now resting in his pocket. He turned it over in his fingers, again and again, as if afraid it might vanish. Ryan still slept inside, laid out on the cot by the window. His breathing had steadied his face, pale under the bruises, but calm. Jake had checked his leg before dawn and changed the bandage. The young man would live. There was a strange peace in seeing him like that, fragile yet human. Skyline or not, he was just another soul tossed into the storm. Buddy sniffed the air and gave a low whine, looking toward the riverbank. Jake followed his gaze. The wind was picking up again, not fierce this time, but light and cool, curling through the trees in small playful gusts. The copper chime on the porch stirred and sang faintly, a gentle thread of sound that drew his thoughts back to his mother. He crouched beside the porch step, where the old floorboards were cracked and uneven. His mother had once told him that every house has a secret heart, a place that holds its memory. He took the key from his pocket, its metal still cold, and slid his fingers along the cracks in the wood until he found the small notch he remembered. He pressed, and a hollow thud answered from beneath. Jake fetched a crowbar from the tool rack and pried up the board. Beneath the layer of dust and age lay a small iron hatch, rusted around the hinges, but still intact. The keyhole sat in the center, shaped exactly like the pine leaf symbol. He wiped it clean and hesitated. For a moment, he thought of Ryan, inside of what might happen if Skyline already knew this place existed. But the thought faded. This was not theirs. It was hers. And now it was his. He turned the key. The lock gave a tired click, then loosened. A faint draft rose from below, cool and dry, carrying the scent of old wood and something metallic. He pulled the hatch open and aimed his flashlight down. A narrow set of wooden steps descended into the darkness. Buddy peered over the edge tail, still but ears alert. Jake gave him a reassuring pat. "Come on, partner. Let's see what she left us." They went down carefully, the boards creaking beneath their weight. The air grew cooler with each step, filled with the echo of water dripping somewhere deep below. When Jake reached the bottom, his light revealed a small underground room, its walls made of wood panels, lined with thin strips of metal that caught the beam and shimmered faintly. The space hummed softly as if the storm above had left its breath trapped within. Jake ran his hand along the wall. The metal was smooth and cold. When the wind outside moved, it slipped through the narrow vents above and made a faint ringing sound. The entire structure seemed alive with vibration, like an enormous instrument built into the earth. He moved deeper inside. The room was lined with shelves, each holding glass jars, rolled papers, and a few wooden boxes. Everything was meticulously arranged despite the years of neglect. On the largest table rested a weathered folder tied with twine. Faded handwriting ran across the front. Riverbend Acoustic Sanctuary. Jake's breath caught. He sat slowly on the nearest stool and untied the string. Inside were diagrams of wind tunnels, sketches of wooden frames, and pages of notes written in his mother's neat script. He scanned the words. She had studied how the movement of wind through specific materials could create natural frequencies that soothed anxiety and lowered the body's pulse. The theory was poetic and scientific, at once sound as medicine resonance as healing. He remembered her long nights in the workshop, the hum of her small recorder, and how she used to say that everything alive sings even when no one listens. He had thought it was a metaphor, but this was proof that she had tried to make it real. On the table beside the folder sat a small metal box with a cracked speaker grill and a spool of magnetic tape. Jake brushed off the dust. Buddy sat down quietly watching. Jake flipped the latch and found a simple label inside for Jake. He hesitated only a second before pressing the small play button. A faint crackle filled the air, followed by a gentle hum. Then came her voice, soft, warm, carrying that familiar rhythm he had not heard in years. "If you are hearing this, my son, then you have found what I could not finish. This project is my life song. The winds of Riverbend carry tones that heal. I have built this place to preserve them before the world forgets how to listen. If you hear my voice, let the wind guide you to what must be restored. Let it teach you how to listen again. Let it lead you to healing." The tape ended with a click. Jake sat motionless, his throat tight. The sound of her voice reached through time, through silence, through grief. It broke something inside him that he had kept sealed for too long. He felt the sting of tears and let them come. Buddy shifted closer, resting his head against Jake's leg. The dog's body was still, his eyes half closed, as if he too could hear something beyond the human range. Jake looked at the metal panels again. A faint note resonated from them, subtle but constant. The sound was like breath moving through the heart of the earth. He whispered, "You really built this for us, didn't you, Mom?" The words vanished into the hum, yet somehow he felt an answer, not in words, but in warmth, in the soft push of wind through the vents. It brushed across his face and stirred the papers on the table. The chime above, the hatch rang faintly, the sound carrying down through the tunnel. Jake closed the folder and placed a hand over it. He could feel the pulse of the place steady and alive. The pieces of his mother's dream were still here, waiting to be understood. For the first time since returning to Riverbend, he felt not lost, but called. The light flickered as another gust moved through the vents. Buddy gave a small sigh and lay down beside the box, his head resting near it, as if standing guard. Jake sat beside him, the glow of the flashlight washing over the notes, the tape, and the walls that seemed to hum with hidden song. Above them, the storm had passed, but the air still carried its echo, a promise whispered through wind and wood that something long buried was ready to awaken. The sun returned to Riverbend with a forgiving warmth. The storm had passed days ago, leaving behind clear skies, an air that smelled of sap and new beginnings. The river ran bright again, swollen but calm, and the trees shimmered with fresh leaves washed clean of dust. In the morning light, the old workshop no longer looked abandoned. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, and the faint music of a repaired wind chime carried through the yard like a promise kept. Jake Miller stood on the porch with a rolled folder tucked under his arm, his eyes drawn toward the winding road that led to town. The Riverbend Acoustic Sanctuary documents rested inside his mother's lifes, work now restored, with his own notes added in careful handwriting. Buddy sat beside him, tail sweeping lightly against the wood, alert but calm. The dog's fur gleamed in the early sun, and his amber eyes watched every motion Jake made as though he understood what this day meant. By mid-morning, the truck rumbled down the dirt road toward town. Nora Hayes sat in the passenger seat, her hair tied back, her ranger's jacket clean, but faded at the seams. She looked the same as always, practical, steady, yet with a quiet spark in her gaze that revealed how much she cared for this land. Jake drove in silence, the folder on the dashboard between them. The road wound past the river, the farms, and the open fields where the grass still bore the marks of fallen branches. "You sure you are ready for this?" Nora asked, glancing at him. Jake nodded slowly. "Ready or not, it is time." She smiled faintly. "That is the spirit." When they reached the community center, the lot was already full. Trucks, old sedans, and bicycles lined the edge of the gravel yard. People gathered on the steps, and near the doors, neighbors Jake had not seen in years. Many were men, with gray in their hair, their postures stiff but proud, wearing the easy marks of age and labor. There were women too, bakers, weavers, carpenters, faces lined by the sun and years of work. Riverbend's people were not loud, but when they stood together, they filled the space with quiet power. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. A long table stood at the front, where two representatives from Skyline Energy waited in crisp suits. One of them, a man named Richard Halden, looked to be in his early 40s, tall, fit, with sharp blue eyes, and hair so precisely combed it hardly seemed real. His face carried the cool confidence of someone who never had to work with his hands. The woman beside him, Evelyn Marsh, had a tablet open, and her tone was clipped and polite whenever she spoke. Nora led Jake to the front row. She gave him a nod that said quietly, the rest was up to him. Jake felt the weight of every eye in the room as he set the folder on the table. Halden leaned back, smiling the way men do when they think they already know the ending. "Mr. Miller, I understand you have some concerns regarding Skyline's Riverbend project." Jake opened the folder carefully. Not concerns. Proof. His voice was steady, though his heart beat hard in his chest. "This land holds more than trees and water. It carries sound natural resonance that has measurable healing effects. My mother spent her life studying it, and I finished what she started." Halden's smile tightened. "I see. And this proof is anecdotal." Jake slid a page forward. "Scientific. Acoustic mapping vibration patterns. Structural analysis of natural materials in this valley." She called it the Riverbend Acoustic Sanctuary. Her work was ignored 30 years ago, but now Your development threatens to destroy it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Halden shifted in his seat, but before he could speak, a voice rose from the back of the hall. It was old Sam Whitaker, a carpenter who had lived near the river all his life. His broad frame and worn hands spoke of decades of work. "You think this land is empty, son," he said to the Skyline men. "I fought 2 wars, and when I came back, it was this river and these trees that taught me how to breathe again. You pave that over, you might as well take away what keeps some of us alive." Another voice joined him. Martha Lane, the baker, short and round her apron, still dusted with flour. "That forest hums when the wind moves, right?" she said. "My late husband used to say it sounded like hope." The room stirred with nods and murmured agreement. Jake stood silent, the folder open before him, watching as his neighbors, many of them veterans' widows, laborers, stood up one by one. Their stories flowed like water, finding its way through stone. They spoke of sleepless nights, eased by the wind, through the pines of the quiet that healed when words could not. Halden tried to interject, but Nora's calm voice cut through. "Skyline has no legal right to proceed until this research is reviewed. These are protected ecological findings. The state will have to investigate." Halden's jaw tightened. He exchanged a glance with Evelyn, then forced a thin smile. Of course, Skyline values community input. But the crowd knew what that meant. The hearing ended not with applause, but with quiet resolve. Skyline's team packed up quickly, their smiles brittle. Outside, the people of Riverbend gathered under the wide summer sky. Some shook hands, others hugged. Jake stood among them, unsure how to absorb the mix of exhaustion and relief that pressed against his chest. Nora turned to him, her eyes bright. "You did it, Jake. Your mother's work is safe for now." Jake exhaled slowly. "No, we did it." Back at the workshop, the evening light painted everything gold. Jake climbed the ladder to fix the last loose board on the roof, while Buddy patrolled the yard, nose buried in the scent of new soil. The storm had taken down 2 trees, but already he had planted seedlings in their place. He hammered the final nail, then stepped back to look. The roof was whole again. Inside the workshop glowed with the low amber of sunset. The chime hung near the window, spinning gently. Jake poured water for Buddy and sat by the open door, letting the light fall across his hands. Buddy lay down near the threshold, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. The wind picked up, threading through the leaves, and the chime above carrying a soft tune that filled the room. Jake leaned back, letting the sound wash through him. It was the same melody that had once drifted through this place when his mother worked the same rhythm of wind, wood, and heart. Only now it belonged to him too. Outside, the people of Riverbend were rebuilding fences, cleaning the roads, and sharing food on porches. The land was alive again. The workshop was no longer a relic. It had become part of a larger harmony, a note among many carried by the wind across the valley. Buddy's tail flicked once, slow, contented motion. Jake smiled faintly, eyes on the glowing horizon. "We did good, boy." The wind answered with a single clear tone, from the chime rising and fading into the quiet like an old song remembered. The morning sun spread across Riverbend with a golden calm that followed days of soft rain. The earth still smelled of moisture and life, and the grass glistened under the light like a field of glass. A warm breeze drifted from the river, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. The world seemed to breathe again, steady and full. Jake Miller stood by the porch of the rebuilt workshop, his brown jacket lightly dusted from work, his hands rough but steady. The place around him had transformed. The roof no longer sagged, the windows gleamed clean, and young trees lined the path toward the riverbank. Beyond the fence, a crowd had gathered for the dedication ceremony of Riverbend Sanctuary. There were old neighbors, veterans, local workers, and families, faces weathered by time and sunlight, their eyes carrying the quiet pride of people who had fought for something larger than themselves. Buddy sat beside him, tail still, ears perked fur, gleaming gold and black in the light. The dog looked strong again, healed from the bruises of the storm, his posture confident and calm. Jake rested a hand on Buddy's head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Nora Hayes was already by the stage, speaking with a few townsfolk. Her ranger uniform was crisp, though her boots were caked with dried mud from the fieldwork she never seemed to stop doing. She had that composed air again, but her smile carried warmth, now not the guarded distance of duty. Nearby stood Sam Whitaker, the carpenter, his thick hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his posture broad and sure. Martha Lane had brought a tray of pies from her bakery, their steam mixing with the summer air. Jake looked at them, all the people who had refused to let Riverbend vanish, and felt something loosen in his chest. For so many years, he had carried the silence of war, the grief of losing his mother, the exhaustion of starting over. But this morning felt different. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of voices, the living and the gone woven together in one breath. The ceremony began quietly. Nora stepped up first, her voice clear and measured. She spoke of the land of the project's preservation, and of the way Riverbend had come together when something sacred was at risk. Then she called Jake forward. The murmurs stilled as he approached the podium. Jake was not a man used to speaking in front of crowds. His voice carried the gravel of years spent working in noise and solitude. Yet when he began, it was steady. "This place was my mother's dream," he said simply. She believed the wind here could heal what the world broke. For a long time, I thought she meant that like a story. But I've learned she was right. The wind carries memory. It carries kindness. And if we listen long enough, it teaches us how to begin again. He paused, looking toward the trees, swaying gently in the distance. Riverbend Sanctuary is not just about sound. It is about people. About remembering that not everything needs to be conquered or built over. Some things are meant to be heard and left to sing. The crowd was silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that hums like music. Then came the soft clap of hands, building slowly until the air filled with applause. After the ceremony, children ran through the field, chasing the small ribbons tied to the fence posts. Each ribbon caught the wind and shimmered blue, the same color Jake remembered from the fragment his mother once left behind. Sam fastened the last post near the edge of the workshop, hammering it into the ground with a firm rhythm. Martha's laughter carried from the porch as she served pie slices to anyone who passed. Nora walked through the grass, checking each wind chime the volunteers had hung between the trees. There were dozens of them, now made of copper steel wood, each one tuned to a different tone. When the afternoon light turned golden, the first gust of summer wind swept through. One by one, the chimes began to sing. Some low, some high, their notes overlapping in a chorus that shimmered across the valley. The sound was bright and human and wild, rising and falling like a tide. Jake stood by the porch again, his heart caught between ache and peace. He felt the wind slide across his skin, warm and familiar. He closed his eyes, hearing the harmony around him. It was not just the chimes. It was the rustle of trees, the murmurs of people, the bark of a dog, the laughter of children. It was life answering itself. He looked down at Buddy, who had risen, now, head lifted ears, pointed toward the sound. The dog let out a single low bark, then another sharper this time, as if calling back to something unseen. The sound carried far across the water and returned faintly in echo. Jake smiled faintly and spoke softly, his words almost lost in the wind. "Mom, I did it." The wind answered, brushing through his hair and setting the chimes into motion again. The air shimmered with their light reflections dancing across the walls of the workshop. For a brief second, Jake thought he saw her, his mother's outline in the sunlit haze, standing by the river, with her hands cupped as if feeling the sound. Then it faded, leaving only the warmth of the air and the hum of the wind. He took a deep breath. The ache of loss was still there, but it no longer hurt the same way. It had turned into something steadier, like the ground beneath his feet. Buddy pressed against his leg, and Jake knelt to scratch behind his ear. "We made it, boy," he said quietly. "We kept it alive." The crowd began to disperse as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The valley glowed in soft orange light, and the air buzzed with crickets and laughter. Jake stayed where he was watching the wind play through the new saplings by the fence. Riverbend was no longer a forgotten corner of the map. It had become a living place again, a sanctuary of sound and faith and resilience. The storms of summer had come and gone, but what remained was stronger than what had been lost. As twilight deepened, the chimes continued to sing. Their tones blended with the wind, carrying the melody far beyond the trees, across the river, and into the fading sky. As the night settled over Riverbend, the chimes kept singing their quiet hymn to the wind. Jake sat on the porch beside Buddy, watching the stars appear one by one over the silver ribbon of the river. The valley breathed with peace and the echoes of human hands and hearts working together. The storms, the doubt, and the grief had become part of the music that shaped this place. Every life, every act of kindness and courage had left its note in the song. Riverbend Sanctuary was no longer only a monument to his mother, but a living reminder that hope can be rebuilt from broken wood and weary souls. Jake thought of how small beginnings could change the world. A single chime hung with care, a hand reaching out to a stranger, a choice to listen rather than turn away. These things did not end wars or erase loss, but they mended the silence where faith had once fallen quiet. He felt the presence of something larger than himself, not in thunder or light, but in the steady pulse of the breeze on his face. In that moment, he understood that miracles were not always grand or loud. Sometimes they came as simple as the wind that keeps blowing after every storm, carrying love between those who choose to keep believing. He looked at Buddy, who lifted his head toward the sound, and then to the sky, as if giving thanks. Jake whispered softly, "May the Lord bless this land, and every soul who finds peace here. To everyone who listens to this story, remember that light often hides inside the smallest things, a voice carried by the wind, a prayer whispered in solitude, or the gentle loyalty of a faithful friend. If you have felt that hope, if you have ever been touched by a quiet miracle, share this story. Leave your thoughts, spread kindness, and subscribe to walk with us through more tales of faith, love, and second chances. May God bless you, and may His wind always guide your heart toward home.